This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. This story is purely fictional and does not promote or encourage any form of violence. Chapter 1. Jade opened her eyes to an uneasy world of grays and blacks, of unidentifiable shapes and soft, sighing sounds. She lay on her stomach, awkwardly sprawled on something cold, slippery, and hard. Her right knee ached, like she'd knocked it, and her right hand stung. "Hello?" Her voice seemed muffled. Something cold and wet feathered across her cheek. She touched her face with numb fingers and shivered. "Phoenix?" The darkness eased somewhat. Perhaps her eyes were adjusting. Around her, patches of light and shadow shifted and swam. It was difficult to tell where the ground ended and the rest of the world began. She gathered her feet beneath her and staggered upright. Shaking, she pulled the hood of her cloak up and tucked her fingers into her armpits to warm them. Her backpack slipped off her shoulder, dragging at her arm. As she took an uncertain step, her foot kicked something long and wooden, her quarterstaff. Snatching it up, she tried to feel more secure. Was she alone here? Wherever this was, it certainly wasn't home. She tried to hold back a rising sense of betrayal. She'd been so certain that finishing level 1 would catapult her home again. It hadn't. This wasn't her England. In fact, it probably wasn't England at all. A wolf howled, distant, mournful, eerie, definitely not England. Sharp, fitful breezes stung her eyes. Jade blinked and scrubbed a hand over her face, trying to hold back bitter tears of disappointment. She just wanted to go home. For the 100th time in the last 5 days, she wished she'd never turned her father's computer on, never been drawn into this bizarre digital world. Wished that she was home again in her warm house with her 6 annoying sisters. She missed her father, her own warm, comfortable bed, and hot showers. Roaming the 8080 world sounded awesome. When she was watching her avatar on a flat screen from the comfort of her father's study, living it was a whole different thing. Her scared 13-year-old mind was trapped inside the digital body and memories of a 17-year-old half-elf in a strange time and place. She'd been nuts to think living the adventures she'd always read about in books would be romantic and exciting. Right now, the most awesome thing she could think of to see would be the giant golden arches of a McDonald's restaurant, or her very own bathroom. The ground crunched as she stamped her feet to warm them. More cold, fluffy stuff fell on her face, and Jade at last realized what it was. Snow. A wolf howled again, closer. A primeval sound that echoed strangely and made the hairs on the back of her neck rise up. Dark forms around her resolved into trees. She was in a snowy, dark forest somewhere. Well, that didn't help much. How could it be snowing at night, when it had been a clear spring dawn in the ancient Britain they had just left? The last thing she remembered was jumping through the portal from Stonehenge in a desperate attempt to escape a horde of Roman soldiers and their ambitious governor, Agricola. She'd thought the portal was going to get her home, but it must have brought her to level 2 of the game instead. If that was right, then home was still a long way off. 4 more levels, in fact. So if she was on level 2, where were Phoenix and the others? A low moan to her left sent her in that direction, feeling her way carefully. A dark lump in the snow moaned again. Her hands touched leather and steel. "Phoenix." He moaned again. "Phoenix!" She dropped to her knees. He lay face down in the snow, his skin cold, his pulse a bare thread. She ran her hands over him, using her spellweaver skills to try and sense injuries. He had fought the Romans until the last to give the rest a chance to get through the portal. Had he been wounded? Her seeking fingers touched wood. She gasped in horror. 2 arrows protruded from his back, very close to his heart. By the feel of them, her instinct was to yank them out. But hesitating, she took her hand away. She had fought the Romans with as much magic as she could. If she pulled them out now, she didn't have the strength to heal such deep wounds quickly enough. He would die. His only chance was if they could find shelter and warmth. She needed food and her herbs to replenish enough strength to save him. She needed help. Where were the others? Oh, my head. A voice behind made her turn. Marcus. She hurried over, slipping in the deepening snow. Strong hands grasped hers. Jade sobbed in relief, clutching at them like a lifeline. Are you okay? Yes. Just a headache bad enough to kill a god. Where are we? The Roman boy sounded pained. Another smaller figure joined them. Somewhere dark, wet and way too cold, it said, helpfully. Bryn. She hugged him, feeling how thin and small he was beneath his patched clothes. Where's Truda? I'm here, the young red-headed girl piped up. It's awful cold here. She wrapped her too big druid cloak tighter about herself. A flurry of wind and snow snatched the hood off her face. In the gloom, her big blue eyes were dark holes in a white oval. Jade grabbed Marcus's hand and hauled him upright. Phoenix has been hurt. We need to find shelter, or he's going to die. Show me, Marcus ordered. She led them to their fallen friend. Marcus felt his pulse for a long moment. He shook his head, barely visible in the gloom. It's too late, Jade. His heart has stopped. He's gone. Phoenix is dead. No. Shoving him aside, she dropped to the cold ground. Her hands shook with fear and cold as she felt Phoenix's jugular. Nothing. Leaning down, she placed her ear against his back, listening hard for breath or heart sounds. Still nothing. No, she whispered again. Yanking the arrows out, she put her fingertips to the wounds. There was no bleeding. Marcus was right. His heart had stopped. She shoved Phoenix over onto his back, trying to remember her CPR classes from school. Laying her hands over his heart, she pushed down as hard as she could, over and over, counting aloud. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Tears dripped down her cheeks and froze into little icicles on her chin. Every once in a while, she stopped to force a breath into his cold lips or to feel for a pulse. The others stood around in awkward, breathless silence, not really understanding her actions. Pump, pump, pump. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Live, you idiot, she yelled finally, thumping his chest in frustration, sobbing. You can't die on me now, Phoenix. You can't leave me here alone. A warm hand covered hers. She looked up blearily into Marcus's grim face. He's gone, Jade, the Roman murmured, his eyes dark with pain. Even if you started his heart again, he would just bleed to death if you can't heal him. Can you? Numbly, she shook her head. She slumped, covering her face, unable to believe it. He can't be dead, Marcus. He can't be. What am I going to do? If he's gone, then I can't go home, either. She ran out of words, as her throat closed up with tears and disbelief. Marcus drew her to her feet and held her. Bryn and Truda gathered close, adding their small bodies, warmth, and shared sorrow. He died a warrior's death. It will be all right, Marcus said at last, stroking her hair. Jade blinked, brushing freezing tears from her cheeks. How could he say that? A warrior's death. What was the use of that? Dead was dead. It wouldn't be all right. He didn't understand. Phoenix was a real person, like her. What had happened to his body in the real world? What would happen to her now? Her only connection to her world was gone. She would be stuck here forever. It wasn't supposed to be like that. She was already supposed to be home. What was she going to do? How could she survive this place on her own? What about her real life? What about her family and Phoenix's? With Phoenix gone, there was no way she could stop Feng Zhudai and save both worlds. This world and her own would be destroyed if Zhudai succeeded in his ultimate plan. They had been drawn here together. They were supposed to stop Zhudai together. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Fresh tears burned her cold cheeks. She turned from Marcus to stare blindly into the dark forest, feeling helpless and very young. Without Phoenix, it just couldn't be done. Zhudai would win. She would die here too, and never see her father again. Jade, Marcus spoke again gently. I know this is tough, but we need your help. If we don't get out of this cold, we'll all die. The wind and snow are picking up. We need to get into shelter. Can you see any nearby? Taking a long, slow breath, she tried to get hold of herself. Here, it wasn't possible to curl up in a ball of misery and hide like she did at home. People depended on her here. Marcus was right. She couldn't let them down. They were all she had now. Pushing aside grief for later, she extended her half-elven senses to penetrate the gloom. There. She pointed off to the left. I think there's a little hut through the trees. Bryn looked toward it, shoulders hunched and thought turned from the freshening winds. I'll go check it out. A wolf called. Its desolate cry was answered by another, somewhere very close. Truda pressed herself into Jade's leg. I don't like wolves, she whispered. Jade closed her eyes, listening to the shadowy forest. They're closing in on us. A pack of 10. They're starving and desperate, or they'd never come near humans. Marcus, we have to get to that hut fast. She looked at him, then down at Phoenix's still form. But Phoenix, we can't leave him here. Help me lift him. Bryn, stay with us. Marcus handed Phoenix's sword to Bryn. The boy grasped it gingerly, struggling to hold its weight up. Marcus sheathed his own weapon and bent down. With a grunt of effort, he picked Phoenix's body up in a fireman's carry over his shoulders. Let's go. I can't carry him far, he groaned. He must weigh 300 libra. Jade snatched up Phoenix's backpack and slung it over her shoulder, staring into the darkness around them. She pushed Truda in front of her. Bryn led the way, sword raised as high as he could lift it. A low-pitched snarling rose from the shadows to their right, making the hairs on the back of Jade's neck rise up. Truda whimpered. Another snarl came from the left. A ghostly, gray shape drifted through the trees, pacing, watching. A second appeared. A third. They slipped closer, ever closer. Faster, Marcus, Jade urged. Which way? He panted. A bit to your left, she instructed. About another 20 or so paces. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A huge she-wolf springing from behind. With a cry of warning, Jade spun, swinging her quarterstaff in a defensive arc. The tip connected solidly with exposed canine ribs. The wolf yelped, twisted in midair to snap at the staff, then landed and backed away with a snarl. Another wolf rushed, snapping at her heels. She jabbed backwards, catching it across the sensitive nose. It yipped and retreated, snarling and snapping at each other. The dogs closed ranks, keeping a pace with the humans as they ran. She reached within herself, searching for reserves of magic she could use against them to buy some time. There were none. She had exhausted herself, escaping from the Romans and helping the Druids at Stonehenge. It was a miracle she even stayed on her feet. Almost there, Bryn called, catching hold of Truda's hand as the child stumbled in the snow. Marcus staggered to the door of the hut and pushed at it with a foot. It was locked. I'll have to break it down. Then we won't be able to close it again. Move over. Bryn shouldered the Roman, completely failing to shift him. Marcus stepped aside, lowering Phoenix to the cold ground. The boy thief crouched down, peering closely at the door. "Give me a second, and I'll get this open." "Marcus," Jade cried, trying to watch all the wolves at once as they slowly closed in on their intended victims. Together, she and Marcus faced the hungry canines with nothing more than a staff and a sword between them. Jade handed Truda her knife and shoved her behind. "Watch over Phoenix and protect Bryn." Trembling, the girl nodded, edging backward until she almost stumbled over Phoenix's prone form. The wolf pack sidled nearer. Jade stood shoulder to shoulder with Marcus and faced the animals with frozen fingers and a racing heart. Was this it? Would they all die here in the freezing snow, torn to pieces by wild animals? Behind the main pack, a single, huge male wolf sat back on its haunches and watched. Jade found her gaze inexplicably drawn to the animal. There was something intelligent, almost regal about its bearing. In a jet-black pelt, its eyes were a startling clear, pale gray. It turned them on her. Its jaw dropped, pink tongue lolling out, and just for a second, she had the strangest feeling it laughed at her. The wind picked up, wailing like a banshee through the treetops. It flung snow in their faces, blinding and cold. The temperature dropped. Jade blinked away the snowflakes, and the sense of connection with the black wolf dissipated. Growling, a closer animal launched itself. She brought her staff around, cracking it across the muzzle. With a yip of pain, it landed awkwardly and scampered backward. 3 more crept in, heads down, muscular shoulders rippling as they looked for a way past the weapons. Marcus jabbed at one, wounding it on the shoulder. It paused, then kept coming. "Any time now, Bryn." Jade whacked another toothy muzzle. "This isn't easy." The boy returned tartly, sawing at the door latch. "The leather is frozen solid. I'm almost through." A huge, silvery animal slunk forward, lips pulled back in a tooth-bearing snarl. It darted around, catching Truda's druid cloak in its fangs and dragging her, trying to separate the smallest, weakest member from the rest of the group. She screamed. Marcus swore. He struck at the wolf's neck and with a single blow, severed its spine. The black wolf howled, raising its muzzle to the night. Truda burst into tears. "Got it!" Bryn yelled. He shoved the stiff door open and yanked Truda to her feet. Together, they dragged Phoenix's body inside. Moments later, Jade and Marcus followed, slamming the door shut and leaning against it. Outside, a horrifying, snarling, snapping, growling ruckus told them exactly what was happening to the wounded animals they'd left behind. For several long moments, the four simply stood, shaking in the darkness. At last, the sickening sounds stopped. The wolf pack moved noiselessly off into the worsening storm. Truda's tears came to occasional sniffs. Someone groaned. The dark silence suddenly became tense again. "Was that you, Bryn?" Jade asked reluctantly. It hadn't sounded like him, or Marcus. "No," the boy whispered. Truda pressed herself up against Jade, shivering. Another groan cut through the apprehensive stillness. "Is someone here?" Jade called, unable to suppress a faint tremor in her voice. There was no answer. The room waited, shadowed and still. She heard Bryn fumbling to pull out his flint and tinder. He struck a small flame. It illuminated the space for long enough to reveal a central hearth, already laid with tinder and wood. There were no other people. He lit a fragment of straw and held it beneath the dry firewood. It caught. Very soon a cheerful, warm fire cast dancing golden light onto rough, thatch and timber walls, and a dirt floor. It wasn't much, but it was better than being outside. Once more a faint groan sounded. Stunned, the four companions looked down. The noises came from Phoenix's body. Jade dropped beside her friend and felt for a pulse. It was ridiculous, of course. They were imagining things. Phoenix was dead. There was no way both she and Marcus could have been mistaken. Thump, 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 a heartbeat, an unmistakable pulse in his throat. Phoenix lived. Chapter 2. He's alive! Jade looked up at Marcus, stunned. With a grunt of effort, she rolled Phoenix over and felt for the arrow wounds in his back. They were gone. Nothing but hard little bumps of scar tissue felt through holes in his jerkin and shirt. Dumbfounded, she rolled him back and stared at him for a moment. He moaned again and opened vague blue eyes. Hope jumped in her heart. He really was alive. It was impossible and incredible, but true. Jade? His words were slurred and low. Where the heck are we? She replied, glancing around the little room. I have no idea. Not home, anyway. She couldn't stop grinning like an idiot. Phoenix pushed himself up from the hard floor, holding his head with one hand. Why are you grinning like an idiot? And why do I feel like a hit-and-run victim? I'm pretty sure you were, dead, she replied at last, touching his shoulder to assure herself he was actually real. Well, as real as it got in this world, anyway. Huh? He blinked at her, then looked at Marcus for confirmation. The young soldier nodded solemnly. 2 Roman arrows through your back. Phoenix twisted his arm awkwardly up behind himself, feeling the scars and holes. He rotated his shoulders, then stared at the backs of his hands as though surprised to see them. I was dead, he shivered, lapsing into confused silence. Let's all get warm, Jade advised, giving him a gentle shove toward the fire. It was a bedraggled, damp and exhausted little group that huddled around the cheery fire. They stared at the flames in silence for a long time. At last, Truda stirred, yawned, and gave them a grateful smile. I'm glad you're alive, Phoenix, she said earnestly. And I'm glad the wolves didn't eat me. And I'm really glad you came and got me. The druids were nice and all. She waggling her plump fingers toward the heat. But I'm looking forward to getting home. I miss my pa. Uh-huh, Jade replied automatically. She wasn't really listening, being more focused on warming her numbed hands and casting sidelong glances at Phoenix. How could he be alive? What did it mean? Yep, Truda added. My pa will be so glad to see me. So will Uller and Ma, but she turned thoughtful. I don't know about Magni or Modi. They can be mean sometimes, but Grandpa Odin will be real glad. He's nice. Uh-huh, Jade repeated, scooting closer to the fire. The pointed tips of her ears were frozen, and she couldn't feel her toes. She was relieved to be out of the wind. It sounded like a regular blizzard rising outside. The wolves howled again, further away now. Inspecting the room again, she spotted a pile of furs and skins in one shadowed corner. Scrambling up, she pulled several closer to the fire. Wrapping a thick fur around the still chattering girl, she handed some to Bryn, who snuggled into them, extending his bare toes almost into the fire. She heaved a huge bearskin to Phoenix, who held it in his hand for several seconds before apparently realizing what he was supposed to do with it. She stared at him again, gratitude mixing with incredulity. He was alive. Even with magic, she'd felt no trace of life before. One arrow had gone right into his heart. How could he possibly be alive? He turned his head to look at her, blue eyes darkened by remembered pain. I was really dead. She nodded at him. He shivered, pulled the fur around his shoulders, and resumed staring at the fire. I tried to kill your father, Marcus, he murmured. Sorry, Jade gasped and glanced at their friend, worried. Bryn and Truda stared at Phoenix, eyes wide, mouths agape. The Roman glanced up, his expression arrested. Don't be. I would have done the same, given a chance, he finally admitted, extending his hands toward the flame. Did you succeed? Phoenix shrugged. Don't think so. Pylum through the shoulder should slow him down for a while, though. Marcus shook his head. Judai will heal him. Phoenix grunted and lapsed back into silence. A short while later, he turned his back, curled up under the fur, and appeared to fall asleep. Eventually, Jade roused herself enough to bring out the Hylian Bajia. She spread the magic bag on the floor and dipped a hand into its black maw. Muttering a request, she drew out the remains of the enormous meal that had been provided 2 days before by the Dryad Queen, Lady Orphanon. There wasn't much left, but it was enough for the 4 conscious companions to each have something with a little left over for Phoenix. A small, logical part of her mind noted that it was still perfectly fresh. Perhaps something in the magic of the bag kept it that way. Will he be okay? Bryn asked, putting a small pot of water on to heat over the fire. Jade cast Phoenix a worried glance, then nodded with more assurance than she felt. I think so. He's sleeping. The arrow wounds are just tiny scars. I guess he just lost some blood and is tired. She sighed and sat down, extending her hands toward the fire. I think we're all worn out. The others agreed wholeheartedly. We should be celebrating, Marcus murmured, chewing on a piece of unleavened bread. Phoenix is alive. We succeeded in our first quest. He waved the bread at Truda. We have the jewel of Asgard, and we're one step closer to killing Feng Judai. Yes, I suppose so. Jade scrubbed at her face, yawning. It's just a bit hard to get all excited when we haven't really rested for 5 days. I'm so tired, my brain feels like it's stuffed with cloth. Plus, I have no idea where we are, or what we're supposed to do next. She clenched her fingers and jaw against a wave of fear and worry. She'd never thought they'd have to face the second level at all. She'd be so certain that just finishing level 1 would be enough to get her home. It wasn't, and now she had no idea what to do. At least with Phoenix back, she wouldn't have to do it alone. I know what you have to do, Truda piped up. The others looked at her expectantly. You have to take me home. She spread her hands and smiled, blinking her big eyes at them. Jade grimaced. We know that. She tried to be patient, but we don't have a clue where your home is from here. Do you know? Oh yes, the little girl replied with bright assurance. It's Bilskirnir. What's a Bilskinor? Bryn cut in. It's my pa's house and it's Bilskirnir, Truda corrected, her small face serious. The druids never could say it right either. They couldn't even say my name right. It's more like Thruder. She said it with a sort of sing-song inflection and almost swallowed the last sound. She smiled at their blank looks. But I like Truda, so you can keep calling me that. Wait. Jade held up a hand. We're getting off track. You are the thing we had to get to complete our first quest. You are the jewel of Asgard. Now I thought Asgard was the place you were from, but this Bill... Whatever. That's your home? A house somewhere? Truda nodded, red braids bouncing. That's where Pa and Ma and my half-brothers are. I've been gone an awful long time. Weeks and weeks, I think. So long I've almost missed my birthday. Uncle Loki stealed me from my bed one night and took me to stay with the druids. He plays silly jokes on us all the time, but this one was a bit as mean. I'm not happy with him at all." She pouted at the fire. The others stared at the girl, dumbfounded. "Your uncle stole you as a joke?" Jade managed at last. "He took you away from your family for months, as some sort of prank?" Truda nodded, apparently not fazed by the situation at all. "Uncle Loki is fun, but sometimes he can be mischievous, Jade prompted. "That's it," the girl exclaimed, beaming. "Loki's not my real uncle, but that's what we all call him." There was a pause. Jade looked thoughtfully at her. Is this kind of behavior normal in your family?" "Oh yes, we're always getting into fights and playing tricks and stuff," Truda replied, poking the fire with a handy stick. "Once my pa dressed up as a bride so he could get back his favorite hammer from Thrym. He was the big meanie giant who stole it." "A bride?" Bryn giggled. "With the flowers and dress and everything, just to get his hammer back." When Truda nodded and looked mildly offended, he howled with laughter, apparently finding it highly amusing that a man would dress up as a girl just to get a tool back. "It's Mjolnir," Truda muttered. "It's a special hammer." Jade shook her head irritably. Somewhere in her brain, a small part was trying very hard to get her attention. Something about Truda was important, something her conscious brain was trying to make sense of, much to the annoyance of her subconscious, which had already worked it out. At last, several things clicked into place. With a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, Jade asked the inevitable questions. "Truda," she interrupted the girl's chatter. "Did I hear you say something about Grandpa Odin before?" Truda nodded, her bottom lip sticking out, eyes huge. Wee. Jade sighed and dropped her head into her hands. "Am I right in thinking that your pa would be Thor then?" "Uh-huh," Truda confirmed, obviously worried that she'd done something wrong. "Is that bad?" Jade glanced up, not sure whether to laugh or cry. She sent a resigned look at Marcus and Bryn, both of whom stared back at her in confusion. "It's not bad," she sighed. "I should have realized, really, when I heard she was the jewel of Asgard." "Would you mind explaining exactly what you should have realized?" Bryn prompted. "Remember what our next task is," Jade reminded him. "We have to return the jewel of Asgard to its owner, Thor." She pointed at Truda. "Asgard is the home of the Norse gods. It turns out that Truda is the jewel and her father is Thor. Thor," she finished with a tired, slightly hysterical laugh, "is none other than the Norse god of thunder and war." Quite appropriately, there was a sudden increase in the ferocity of the wind outside, followed by a distant rumble of thunder. Truda looked up, her face alight with excitement. "Pa!" She jumped up and raced toward the door. Marcus was quicker and barred her way. Jade followed. She still had trouble believing that, in this realm, the Norse gods and their powers were actually real, not just exciting stories she'd read. It was pretty daunting. "Oh no." Marcus grabbed Truda's arms and held her still. "You can't go outside in this storm. You'd freeze in 10 seconds. And remember the wolves." "But it's my pa up there," she wailed, pointing to the ceiling. "Right now, he's up in his chariot, throwing Mjolnir to make the thunder and lightning." She stomped one slippered foot and looked mutinous. "I want to see my pa." "Come on." Jade tried to be reasonable. "If you did go out now, he wouldn't be able to see you or hear you in all this snow and wind anyway." Truda looked doubtful for a moment, then her expression firmed again into determination. "He might," she scowled, folding her arms. Abruptly, Jade had had enough. She was too tired to cope with a tantrum-throwing kid at the moment, God's daughter or not. She jerked her head at Marcus, and together they moved aside. "Fine," she said coolly. "Go out and yell your head off. I don't care. In fact, if he does hear you, it makes our job much easier, but," she warned when Truda's face lit up, "don't blame me if your yelling attracts the wolves. Right now, we're in no position to fight any battles for you." She stood back and folded her arms too, watching the precocious child. Truda flounced to the door and grabbed the inside, wooden door latch. She opened it a fraction. Wind and flurries of snow slipped in, making the fire flicker and jump. She shivered, but opened it a little wider and peered up into the heavy blue dark sky. Cupping a hand around her mouth, she shrieked into the wind. "Pa! Pa! Come and get me, Pa!" Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its wild, weird call. Its packmates answered with a hair-raising, disharmonious chorus. Some were still quite close by the hut. Truda slammed the door shut and pressed her back to it, eyes wide. She straightened up with a quirky, apologetic sort of grin at Jade and Marcus. "Maybe I'll just wait until we get to Bilskirnir then." "Wise move." Jade exchanged ironic, laughing glances with Marcus. She ushered Truda back to the fire, where the girl-child snuggled under the furs with a dispirited sigh. Bryn produced his little wooden whistle and twiddled a few tunes until Truda complained it was too shrill. They huddled together beneath the furs, looking very young and very sleepy. Jade watched. Someone had to be responsible for them. True, Bryn was a tough kid. He'd looked after himself for months after his parents had been killed by Roman soldiers on orders from Feng Judai. Truda, however, might be the daughter of a god, and as tall as Bryn, but she was really very young. Jade looked away, tears filling her eyes. This was stupid. Her responsible for 2 kids? In her world, she was hardly more than a kid herself. She missed her own father fiercely. Taking Truda back to her father suddenly seemed like a very difficult task. Instead of being safely back home, as she'd hoped, she was stuck trying to save both this world and her own from Feng Judai's schemes. Somehow they had to stay out of Judai's clutches and find Thor. But where? She had no idea. She'd read a little bit of Norse mythology back home, but not enough to remember where Thor hung out. A vague recollection that all the Norse gods lived in Asgard didn't really help much. How did they get to Asgard? How long would it take? Then it occurred to Jade that Judai would still be hunting for them, even though they'd left ancient Britain. She shivered and clutched the furs closer. If the warnings of the druids and the strange woman in gray were true, then Judai wanted Truda for some power she had. He wasn't likely to give up easily if she had something that would let him control or destroy the world. Archvillains were like that. Tenacious, ruthless. They had to find a way to get the girl home, quickly. "Jade?" Truda's sleepily worried voice interrupted her thoughts. She scrubbed a hand over her face and added a little wood to the fire, trying to push aside her fears. Marcus, nearby, paused in the act of sharpening his sword to listen. "It is almost my birthday, you know," the young girl murmured, her eyes drooping. "That's nice," Jade replied, watching sparks fly up from the fire. "I've sort of lost track, but I think it's only about 5 or 6 days away. I'll be 7 and I really do have to be home by my birthday." She lay down, pillowing her head on a fur, and dragged another over her bare legs. "We'll do our best," Jade sighed. Marcus smiled at her. Truda yawned. "No, I mean I really have to be home. If I'm not, then spring won't come. Winter will stay, men will die everywhere. It will be the worst winter ever. Then will come the fires, then wars between the gods and giants. It would be the beginning of Ragnarok, the end of all the 9 worlds. So I really have to She fell asleep in mid-sentence. Chapter 3. Phoenix curled under the firs, staring at the rough timber wall. He heard the low murmur of voices as Jade and the others talked about where to go next. But none of it had really registered. One thought possessed his mind. I'm alive. He'd been dead, gone, finito, over, finished, kaput. He knew it. Every cell in his body somehow knew it. It had only been for a few minutes, but he didn't think he'd ever forget it. There had been no near-death experience, no white light to stay away from, no seeing his body from outside, just nothing. And that had scared him more than anything. Was it only nothing because this was a digital world, so his death hadn't been real? That old woman in the gray limbo land had said this world was as real as their own. Dying had certainly felt real. Without really wanting to, he relived it. In some ways, death had come as a relief. The blinding agony of those 2 Roman arrows in his back was unbelievable. Drawing a breath became impossible. He felt his body shutting down and almost welcomed it. Pain vanished. Fear slipped away along with his consciousness. Coming back to life was the shock. At the time, Phoenix only registered that he was numbingly cold and wet. He slipped in and out of awareness as the others carried him towards the hut. He barely remembered the wolf attack, just the cold, weakness, pain. Now inside the hut, he was content to lie in the furs in order to just think for a while. Sleep wasn't yet an option. It seemed too much like the nothingness of death. Instead, he reveled in the sensations that told him he lived. The sound of his own breath, his heart, the rush of blood surging through his veins, even felt the fuzz on his unbrushed teeth. It was hard to believe that this was only a digital body, not a real one. The complexity of a software program which could make everything so very real was unimaginable. He felt real. Death had felt real, too real. Coming back to life was impossible. But then, so was being magically transported into an adult body in a different world. Maybe the old lady who'd told them this world was real was right. Maybe it was. He was so used to this warrior's form now that it was hard to remember living in his gawky 13-year-old body at all. After being killed once, he now had a very strong desire to keep this body healthy. Most of all, the overwhelming idea that he had actually died kept hijacking his brain, derailing every attempt at focusing on the future. All he could think about was the past. For 3 years, he had been angry at his father for dying in a car accident in the real world. For 3 long years, he had blamed his father for giving up and leaving his family when they needed him. At the scene of the accident, the paramedics told his mother that her husband had just lost too much blood and had too many injuries to be saved. Phoenix hadn't believed them. He'd always thought that his dad could have lived, if he'd really wanted to. He thought it just showed his dad didn't care enough about his family to stay around. Now, finally, Phoenix had a dim insight into what his father must have been through. His body had sustained far fewer injuries, but he had been glad to let go when the pain got too much. All thoughts of Jade and getting both of them back home had become irrelevant. He hadn't even tried to hang on. Somewhere, deep inside, an old knot of pain dissolved forever. For the first time in years, Phoenix could think about his father with love and regret, rather than anger and hurt. For the first time, he could painlessly remember all the great fun things they had done as a family, how hard his dad had worked to support them, how he'd never missed any of Phoenix's Aikido gradings or school functions. Phoenix struggled to come to terms with how he felt. It was like he'd somehow let his father down by not appreciating their time together, and by being so angry with him when he died. His throat closed as he fought back long-suppressed tears. Voices intruded on his thoughts. Someone, maybe Truda, said something about the end of the world. A somewhat stunned silence followed. Phoenix drifted slowly up from his own memories and resurfaced in this reality to glance around. Jade was staring at him, frowning and nibbling on her lower lip as she did when she was really worried. He rubbed a hand through his long hair and sat up. Time to rejoin the land of the living, mentally as well as physically. "What?" he prompted her. "You okay?" She cast an anxious look at the sleeping girl as though she wanted to ask him something else, but felt obliged to check his health first. He shrugged. "Guess so. I was dead, now I'm not. I'll get used to it, I suppose." "But how?" Jade began, distracted by his words. "The daggers, remember?" Phoenix tapped the hilt of his iron dagger where it sat on his hip. He pulled it out, turning it so 6 of the 7 rubies embedded in the handle glowed blood red in the firelight. One jewel was cracked, dulled into an ugly, dirty, dark pink. She sat up straight, pulling out her own bronze blade. He watched as understanding sank in. They each had 7 lives in this game world. They'd guessed that these might be represented by the 7 rubies in their respective daggers, but they hadn't been certain. Now they were. The gems in her knife hilt were unsullied, for she had lost no lives. He saw, too, fear dawn as she realized that he had only 6 lives left. It looked like there really were still 4 levels of the game to complete before they could hope to get home to the real world. Each level would be more challenging than the last. Half a dozen lives might not be enough. He grimaced at her look of horrified comprehension. They would just have to be enough. It was just a game, after all. He'd played enough to know how it worked. If he kept his wits about him, he could pull them through. Besides, it was still kind of fun. Apart from the dying bits, anyway. He'd just have to avoid doing that as much as possible. "I don't understand," Marcus interrupted. "What has your dagger got to do with not dying? I thought the druid's spring equinox rites must have healed you the way they did me." He turned his bare leg to show a thin, healed sword wound. Phoenix knew it had been inflicted only a short time before, by Roman soldiers. Phoenix saw Jade open her mouth. Before she could say anything, he touched her on the arm and shook his head. "I think Marcus has proved we can trust him, Jade. I vote we tell him everything now. We can bring Bryn up to speed later, when he wakes up." Jade shut her lips, gave a reluctant nod, and stayed quiet while he did his best to explain without resorting to techno-babble about computers. That would be magic in this world, anyway. Marcus glanced between them. "You're saying that the 2 of you have come from another world to this one by magic," he said evenly. "You have more than one life, and the magic is somehow linked to your knives and those 2 amulets you wear." Jade drew out the necklace she wore tucked under her clothes. Phoenix lifted his off his chest. Side by side, it could be seen that the amulets fitted together neatly. 2 curved teardrop shapes, one in pearly silver, one in gold, and each with a dot of the other color in it. It was the ancient Chinese yin-yang symbol, indicating balance and harmony. "Why don't you just use magic to make the amulets take you home again?" Marcus seemed almost angry. "Why do we have to go through this?" He waved a hand around, indicating the hardships they had already encountered and were certain to meet ahead. "We tried," Jade assured him, "but it didn't work." "I'm pretty sure now," Phoenix cast a sidelong glance at Jade, who sighed and nodded, "that we have to complete all 5 quests in order to save both our worlds from Judai and get back to ours. We also," he added as an afterthought, have to make sure our amulets stay out of Judai's hands. Evidently, they would give him some sort of extra power. Marcus shuddered at the thought. For several tense moments, he stared hard at them both, his face an unreadable mask. Phoenix wondered if he were annoyed with them, or even afraid of them. Both would be understandable. As they watched, the tension drained from his shoulders and the Roman sat down cross-legged before them. And this new quest? Marcus seemed to accept the situation, even if he didn't understand it. Jade brought Phoenix up to date on what they knew of Truda and Thor. Okay, Phoenix mused. So the question remains, where are we and what do we do next? He eyed Jade. What was it Truda said before? Something about the end of the world. She shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. She said if we don't get her back to Thor and her home by her birthday in 5 or 6 days, winter will not end. Then there will be wars between gods, followed by the end of the world. They call it Ragnarok. He looked at her for a while, trying to process the information. He looked at Marcus, who seemed unfazed as he resumed rhythmically sharpening his sword. He looked at the sleeping Truda, innocent-seeming instigator of another adventure. Is that the end of the world 5 days or so from today? He asked. Or from tomorrow? Phoenix. Jade seemed shocked at his cavalier attitude. Don't you get it? We've only got 5 days to get her home to Bilskinor before all hell breaks loose. He held up his hands for peace. I get it. I get it. I just don't know what we're supposed to do about it right now. It's the middle of the night, in a storm, in a God-knows-where forest, and we're surrounded by wolves. What do you want me to do? He has a point, Marcus put in. We're best off getting some sleep while we can. If the storm has died down in the morning, we can work out where we are. Jade flung off her furs, stood up and strode to the door and back several times before finding the words to express her obvious agitation. But what if the storm goes on for days? What if we do get out, but the wolves come back? What if we can't find Bilskinor? What if we can't find where we are? What if Judai tracks us down again, or Agricola follows us? We can't let them get our amulets or Truda, remember. Agricola is governor of Britain by the wishes of Titus, emperor of Rome, Marcus reminded her. My father can't leave his post just to chase us around the world. We're safely away from him. And what about Judai? She shot back. Marcus twisted his mouth up in a grimace. Now that's another thing altogether. Is that illusion spell you put on me still working? Jade sucked a quick breath. Phoenix glanced at her in surprise. Had she forgotten her own handiwork? In Britain, Judai had been able to use his magical abilities to track Marcus by far-seeing, because he knew the son of the governor by sight. Once they'd realized it, she had placed a spell on Marcus to deflect Judai's sight. Tilting her head, Jade narrowed her eyes at Marcus, her gaze unfocused, and she didn't blink for so long that Phoenix's own eyes began to water in sympathy. Finally she nodded, and he saw relief flicker across Marcus's face. And he's never seen the rest of you, so Judai doesn't know where we are, the Roman noted. If he can't find us, he can't send anyone after us. Jade sank back down, some of the worry easing from her expression. So how do we find out where we are, and where we have to go to get Truda home then? Phoenix shrugged. In the morning we climb a mountain or a tree, and find the nearest village and ask them how to get to Bilskinor. We know we have to return the jewel, Truda, to Thor, so we can probably assume we're somewhere in one of the countries that follow the Norse gods. Don't forget the second half of our quest, he reminded them. We're also supposed to get hold of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. We need it for the third quest. Jade groaned. Stealing things from gods is always hazardous to your health. Marcus expelled a short breath and nodded. Phoenix scrubbed a hand across his hair. Dust flew out. I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The first thing is to find out where we are and how to get to Bilskinor. So, do either of you know anything about these Norse lands? Jade prompted. Marcus shook his head. My sister's husband, Tacitus, has traveled the Germanic countries somewhat, but I confess I never read his journals. He mentioned barbaric, petty kingdoms spread across many lands and separated by a narrow sea. The Swabian Sea, I think. That's all I remember, he admitted. His writings make dull reading. I never paid much attention in geography, Phoenix admitted. He eyed Jade expectantly. She was the bookworm. She dropped her chin into her hand and gazed into the fire. I'm pretty sure that the countries we call Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Poland, and Germany are all Norse people in our world. I just can't remember what we call the sea that's in the middle of them all. It joins the North Sea. She huffed, clearly frustrated that the name eluded her. For goodness sake, I could tell you exactly what plants grow there. Sitting up, she stretched and twisted her back with a grimace. We'll have to ask someone. We'll look pretty stupid saying, hey, what country are we in, though? The Baltic Sea, Phoenix exclaimed, recalling a documentary he thought he'd successfully ignored in history class. That's what we call the Swabian Sea, Jade glared, visibly irritated he had remembered it before she had. Helpful, she scoffed. Now all we need to know is, oh wait, she said in mock surprise, where we are and where to go. Hey, Phoenix glared right back at her, stung. That was uncalled for. She flushed and turned away. We're not going to get anywhere tonight. I'm going to sleep, she muttered. Jerking the furs up over her shoulder, she lay down with her back to the others. Phoenix watched her for a few moments, annoyed by her petty arguing. Why was she so hung up on being a smart-ass know-it-all? What did it matter who knew the name of a stupid sea? When he looked up, he found Marcus returning his gaze gravely. She's frightened, the Roman commented, putting his sword aside and stoking the fire. Phoenix shrugged. We all are. Does she have to take it out on me? You're the only connection she has to your world. His reply was cryptic. So, he blinked at Marcus, confused. You died. She was stranded here when she thought she'd be home. She was angry, scared, and alone. Marcus leaned back on his furs and crossed his legs at the ankles, staring into the fire with an oddly wistful expression on his face. Oh, Phoenix paused, suddenly understanding. It was exactly how he'd felt when his father had died, angry and scared. He rotated his shoulders, still feeling a faint ache between the shoulder blades. I'll try not to let it happen again. It wasn't much fun, anyway. He grinned at Marcus, who smiled a little in return. I think we'd all appreciate that. Many thousands of miles away, Long Bayou smiled. Staring into the cold blackness of his cell, he let his mind drift. Judai's shields around his cell were strong, but flawed, as was much of his work. It cost Bayou dearly to keep a light link with his rescuers over such a distance. Enough to know they were safe, but not enough to communicate. Now he knew they were truly on the path to complete their second quest. He could afford to rest a little. They had yet to realize their true goal, of course, but that would come in time. With each new experience, they grew and learned, and their chances of surviving to find and free him increased. Many of the obstacles they faced were in their minds. Anyway, only when these were overcome would they truly be able to release him and themselves from bondage. As he let his thoughts float, Bayou became aware of something else, the gossamer touch of another mind seeking his. Before he could withdraw, it seized him, striking and tearing at his mental shields with fearful force. Judai. Baiyu wrenched his mind free and withdrew into the weak shelter of his exhausted body. Shivering, he strengthened his inner defenses. How could he make such a stupid mistake? Judai's shields were not weak. The flaws were simply a temptation. How could he let himself be lulled by the belief that his rescuers were safe, away from Judai's influence in Britain? Now Judai knew through which land the four traveled. He had plucked that much, at least, from Baiyu's incautious thoughts. He wouldn't know exactly where, but it would not take him long to find out. Unable to restrain himself, Baiyu released a howl of anguish that echoed off the uncaring stone walls. Chapter 4. A soft, sighing sound from one of the others roused Jade from a semi-doze. She had woken when the fire died down in the wee hours. It was the first night they hadn't set watches, and she'd been too uneasy to go back to sleep after stoking the flames. The storm gentled sometime after midnight, but cold still seeped through the walls of their shelter. It was now hours later, and dawn breathed gray light beneath the door. She glanced at her companions, then down at the pile of fur on her lap. She was almost finished making warm clothes for their little group. When she couldn't sleep, she'd started turning the remaining pile of furs and skins into cold weather gear. In all the fantasy books she'd read, no one ever had to make their own clothes. It was either not mentioned, or some kindly villager just turned up and handed the hero what he needed. Here, there was no one. Luckily, she seemed to know how to sew in this world, and she'd found a small sewing kit tucked into a chest of furs in the corner. The bone needle slipped through her cold fingers as she cast a troubled look at Phoenix's sleeping form. Guilt twisted her stomach into knots. She'd heard Marcus's comments last night and unhappily faced her own childish reactions toward Phoenix. She was finding this all much, much harder than she'd thought it would be. He seemed to see the whole thing as some big, exciting lark of an adventure. He enjoyed bouncing from one fight to the next, one perilous situation to another. He treated it like it really was just a computer game they would inevitably win. For Jade, it seemed much more real, too real most of the time. She was scared almost all the time and far less certain of victory. Phoenix clearly didn't see the infinite number of things that could go hideously wrong here. His unwavering nonchalance was annoying, and reassuring too. As long as he thought they could win, she carried a faint hope that he was right. When he died, it had terrified her. Suddenly, for the first time in her life, she was completely alone. Marcus and Bryn didn't really count. They were part of this world. With Phoenix gone, there was no one to rely on, to believe in, only herself. And that wasn't enough. She wasn't enough. Sniffing, Jade blinked away stinging tears and refocused on her work. She misjudged the next stitch and caught a breath as the needle stuck into her finger. Blood welled and she stuck it into her mouth, trying not to cry again. She was good enough. She had to be. The others slept on. Sometime later, as sunlight brightened the room, Bryn sat up and shoved his bedding aside with a yawn. Phoenix sat up too and nodded at the boy, noticing the tracks of tears on his grubby face. He recalled that Bryn had lost his last brother in the battle at Stonehenge. There wasn't much he could really say, though, so he didn't mention it. The kid was strong, and he had them as a family now. What's for breakfast? The boy stretched, yawning again. Phoenix glanced around the small timber hut, but there were no convenient refrigerators or vending machines to be seen. He sighed. Time to hunt. One of the major drawbacks to living 2,000 years in the past. That, and a complete lack of flush toilets. Speaking of which... Come on. He jerked his head toward the door. Let's go find a... tree. Bryn flashed him a knowing grin and nodded. Phoenix squared his shoulders. Then I guess we'll have to rustle up something to eat and see where we are, too. We're going out to hunt up breakfast, he calmly informed Jade as they headed for the door. She opened her mouth, signs of worry clouding her green eyes. Phoenix just looked at her and raised an eyebrow. Something in his face must have told her that he wasn't in the mood for discussion, so she shut her jaw with a snap and nodded. As they eased open the door, she touched him on the leg. He glanced down. "Phoenix." She seemed hesitant, and he guessed she was feeling bad for sniping at him last night. Strangely, though, he didn't need her apology. He just smiled at her and gave her the thumbs up before slipping out the door. When they returned and thrust open the door, Phoenix stepped out of the crisp, cold air and into the warm room with some relief. "Hey!" Jade exclaimed, shivering as she sat, hunched over her stitching. "Born in a barn." "Sorry," he apologized cheerfully, shutting the door again. He swung a large bird off his shoulder onto the dirt floor near the fire. She stared at it, openly astonished. Phoenix hoped it was edible. There wasn't much other game around, and they'd seen signs of the wolves, so they didn't want to stay out long. The bird looked like some sort of turkey, gray with a black head and bright red bits above its glazed eyes. It had a long tail that looked like it would fan out. "Oh," Truda's sleepy voice called out. "An auerhund. A wood grouse, you call it. Yummy. My ma roasts them with lots of tubers and wild onions." Her stomach rumbled loudly, and she looked surprised. "I'm so hungry." She scratched her head. Her thick braids were in disarray, creating a fuzzy halo of red hair about her face. Phoenix grinned at the girl. He was hungry too, although a bowl of cornflakes would have been better. Longingly, he recalled the taste of orange juice, cereal, toast, and milk, and sighed in regret. Not today. Heck, electric toasters wouldn't even be invented for at least 1800 years. In a short space of time, the fire had been refueled, and the game been cleaned and baked in the hot coals. After the bones were picked clean, they dressed in the new furs and packed their gear. As a group, they sat in a small circle to discuss what to do next. When we went hunting, Bryn and I climbed the tallest tree we could find on a hill. Phoenix looked around at the others. They waited expectantly. "We're in the middle of a huge forest. Really huge, I mean," he warned. "It looks like there's a big lake off to the east and another off to the west. Lots of hills and valleys in between. Rough walking, no matter what direction we take." "So did you see any towns?" Jade pressed. Phoenix exchanged glances with Bryn. "We think we saw a faint smoke trail off to the northeast, near the lake, but it's so glary today with the new snow that we can't be sure. So that sounds like our only option," she agreed, her tone suggesting she wasn't very happy with the lack of choices. "Well, I sure can't guide you anywhere else," Bryn muttered, sounding disgruntled. Phoenix cast him a narrow look, making a mental note to keep an eye on the boy. He needed to be useful, or he might be tempted into mischief. Truda jumped up and brushed off her new fur pants, clearly excited to be moving closer to home. "Let's go then." The others gathered their gear and filed out of the hut and squinted around at the tall, white-dusted trees. "I just wish we knew where we are now," Jade sighed. Truda tucked a cold hand into hers and smiled trustingly up at her, and then at Phoenix. "As long as we're not anywhere near Trolltiven or Thursvidur, I don't mind." Everyone looked at her in silence. "Do we want to know why?" Bryn finally asked. Truda shook her head, making her braids bounce. "Trolls and ogres live there," she said darkly, her blue eyes wide. Big trolls and really, really nasty ogres. Are we there now? Would you recognize those places if you saw them? Phoenix asked, not expecting much joy from her answer. Truda looked around and shrugged. I don't think so. I've been to Trolltiven once, or near it anyway, but it was ages ago, so I don't know. Oh good, Jade groaned. Trolls, ogres, wonderful. Phoenix caught Marcus's eye and grinned, laying a hand on his sword. Marcus inclined his head, his lips twitching into a small smile. We'll keep an eye out for them, then. Think you can keep us going northeast, Bryn? Phoenix clapped a hand on the boy's shoulder. He straightened with a nod. There was a brighter, more determined look on his thin face as he led them away from shelter and into the unknown. Once away from the clearing around the hut, a vast forest quickly swallowed the little band of travelers. Enormous pine trees towered overhead, their evergreen needles filtering weak sunlight into a thin greenish gloom. Footfalls were muffled by snow and a thick bed of brown needles. In the cold, muted stillness, each breath sounded harsh and loud. The only other noise was the constant trickling and dripping of water. And once, in the distance, the desolate howl of a solitary wolf. Bryn led, followed by Marcus, Jade, Truda, and finally Phoenix. It was hard going. The route could have possibly been a deer path or perhaps a track laid to the hut by a fur trapper. Faint and tortuous, it twisted around giant tree trunks and huge gray boulders. It took all of Phoenix's concentration just to keep his footing. The ground lay ankle-deep in snow that quickly turned slushy as the sun rose higher. Hidden beneath, moss-covered rocks and patches of ice made the path treacherous to the unwary. Truda stumbled and almost fell a dozen of times. Each time, he caught her up, straining to keep her from landing face first in mud and ice. The track led them down a narrow stream bed that sliced between two high ridges. Darker and colder, the forest grew wild and ominous, full of creaking tree branches and strange shadows. A light wind sprang up high in the treetops, sounding like 1,000 people whispering in the sky. As they followed the little stream downhill, the air grew moist and very slightly warmer. At the base of a particularly steep stretch of ravine, the stream widened and joined another. Now a small river, it turned directly northeast and rushed whitely over large, dark gray boulders. Every so often, Phoenix thought he could smell the faintest hint of wood smoke, but it was never strong enough to be sure. He watched in amusement the puffs of white breath erupt from everyone's mouths. Their heads steamed in the cold air. Inside the fur clothing, he was stiflingly hot from the exercise of walking, but it was too chilly to take them off. His fingers and nose were cold. He sniffed, wishing for tissues as his nose began to dribble. Irritably, he wiped it on the back of his leather sleeve and smiled. His mother would have a fit. Phoenix looked up, intending to tell Bryn to call a rest halt, and caught sight of Jade's expression. She was sending harried looks back her shoulder in the direction they'd come, her green eyes immense with an anxious effort to pierce the half-light of the forest floor. "What is it?" he asked, tensing. She bit on her lip, hesitated, then shrugged. "Not sure. I just feel like we're being followed." He sucked in a slow breath and deliberately released the tension in his chest. He looked about, surprised by her disquiet. The area appeared no different to any other section of the woods they'd passed through. The ground had leveled off a little, improving visibility. There was practically no undergrowth between the massive tree trunks. It would be almost impossible for anything or anyone to sneak up on them. Nothing that his warrior mind could see as a potential threat or ambush site presented itself. But Jade's elven intuition had served them well before. He'd be stupid to ignore it. "I can't see anything. You're sure?" She shook her head. "No, I just feel edgy. I'm not even sure if it's something behind us or in front." "We'd best keep moving then," he said firmly. "Keep a sharp lookout, guys," he addressed Marcus and Bryn in a low tone. "Jade thinks we're being watched." Jade tilted her head to one side and pressed her mouth into a thin line. "I don't think it's anything right here," she clarified. "It's something about..." She waved a hand about, indicating their surroundings. "Everything. I don't know." Frustration was clear in her tone. "There's just something not right." She grimaced. "Sorry." Phoenix laid a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Hey, don't beat yourself up. You've warned us. Now it's up to us to be alert. Let's get a move on." He glanced up at the thin blue sky far above. "I'm guessing the days will be a bit shorter if we're further north. If you're right, we don't really want to be caught out in the forest at night." She opened her mouth as though she were going to argue with him just for the sake of it, but apparently changed her mind. She shut her mouth as sharply and nodded. Phoenix felt oddly elated by that short interchange. He was getting the hang of it, this leadership thing now. He just had to be firm and decisive rather than bossy. Of course, it helped that he'd listened to her fears and taken them seriously. Smiling to himself, Phoenix took up his position in line. Maybe there was hope after all. A wolf howled. It sounded close. Moments later, another answered, definitely closer. "The wolves from last night?" Phoenix asked sharply. "Is that what you're sensing?" Jade's knuckles were white on her staff. "Maybe. Part of it, at least. Yes, I can feel them now. There are more than 20 this time. They're coming at us fast. I just don't know if that's the only thing." She shook her head helplessly. "One thing at a time." He gripped his sword hilt. "Let's move a little faster, people. Keep an eye out for shelter or at a pinch a big rock we can climb onto." They picked up the pace, stumbling over the uneven, slippery ground, trying to watch for shadowy forms in the trees as well as where their feet were going. More howls followed them, then soft, sharp barks and curious whines that carried clearly in the crisp air. It sounded like the pack was communicating. Still, the wolves were hidden from sight, even though their noises came from everywhere now. "There," Jade panted, pointing off to the right. The others caught the merest flicker of movement. And another. The pack closed in. Truda sucked in great sobbing breaths as she struggled to keep up the grueling pace. Time after time, she slipped, held up only by Phoenix's hand under her arm. Lean gray wolf bodies finally showed themselves. They slid in and out of faint patches of sunlight, sometimes nearer, sometimes further away, as though taunting their prey. All around, the barks, whines, and growls continued. Abruptly, 3 animals on the right surged closer, almost coming within weapons' reach. They snarled and growled, dashing forward, then scurrying back with flattened ears and tucked-in tails as sword or staff struck at them. Bryn veered to the left, away from the sharp white teeth snapping at his arm. Phoenix pounded grimly on behind Truda and the others, wondering what the hell the wolves were waiting for. Why didn't they just attack? It was almost as if they were just herding the humans, but that made no sense at all. Wolves didn't behave like that, did they? Beneath their feet, the ground leveled. Ahead, the woods opened to reveal a small lake, glassily reflecting the pale blue sky. Bryn skidded to a halt at the water's edge, turning to cast a desperate look first at Phoenix, then left and right along the gently sloping shore. There was no sign of shelter, no rocks, no caves, and no huts this time. 24 wolves eased out of the shadows, sliding into a perfect half-circle around the travelers. Pink tongues dangled over wicked, pointed teeth. Lean gray legs bunched, ready to spring. There was nowhere left to run. Chapter 5. One more wolf padded out of the gloom to sit directly before the children. Jade drew a quick breath. It was the same gray-eyed black wolf from last night. His ears twitched toward her, and for a second, she could have sworn his gray eyes stared right into hers. He sat before them with regal poise, and somehow amusement on his long face, radiating power and alpha control. It was clear the pack awaited only his command before attacking. Phoenix slid out his sword, its metal-on-metal slither bizarrely out of place in this isolated forest. Slowly, Marcus unslung his bow and drew an arrow forth from its quiver. The black wolf began a low, almost subsonic growl. The rest of the pack took it up until Jade felt it thrum through her body. She clapped her hands over her ears, trying to shut out the sound, the sense of strangeness, the unnerving weirdness of the whole situation. It didn't work. There was something very wrong. "Why haven't they attacked?" Phoenix whispered. Jade shook her head. "I don't know. I can't think clearly. I don't know what's wrong with me." She clung to her staff, using it to hold herself up. Her head spun with the weight of foreboding and fear. "Can't you put them all to sleep or something?" Phoenix urged. Jade shook herself, trying to focus. "I'll try." She half closed her eyes, attempting to keep her skittish mind on the task at hand. "Sleep," she commanded, pointing at the alpha wolf. The black wolf blinked at her, opened his mouth wide in a toothy yawn, and shook his head, but stayed disappointingly upright. She gasped. The others cast her puzzled looks. She shook her head. "It didn't work. There's something blocking me. I don't think any of my spells will work." Phoenix cast a quick look about, pointing to where the sun hung, ominously low, behind the trees to the southwest. "We'll just have to think of something else, fast. It'll be dark soon and we can't stay here all night, watching wolves. Suggestions?" "We could head north along the lake edge," Marcus offered. "That way we can keep watching them and they can't outflank us." "Sounds good," Phoenix agreed. He hadn't taken his eyes off the wolves. Jade couldn't think of an alternative, so she went along with the others as they began to move slowly north. The loss of her magic shook her to the core. She'd tried several spells, muttering them under her breath at the oblivious wolves. Nothing worked. Deeply frightened, she trailed behind Phoenix and Bryn, bereft and lost. As they approached the closest wolf, the animal eyed Phoenix before glancing at the black wolf. The alpha jerked his chin up and gave a sharp yip. The wolf backed up, opening a gap along the lakeshore. They were letting their prey go, or were they? Just as Jade began to hope they would all back off, the pack formed into a line and began to pace alongside, picking up speed, pushing the humans to run faster, but always keeping a cautious distance, just beyond sword point. "They're hurting us." Jade caught up to Phoenix and couldn't keep the fear out of her voice. He nodded in reply. "I just wish we knew where. Can't you do anything?" She shook her head. "I've been trying, but it seems like the further we head this direction, the worse my control over magic gets. I can barely think coherently, let alone formulate a spell correctly." She leaned on her staff as she ran, drawing deep, shuddering breaths, glancing forward. "It's as though whatever it is we're going towards has some way of scrambling my brain and my magic. I'm scared, Phoenix." "Tell me about it," he muttered, frowning. "This is turning out to be one of the less enjoyable adventures we've had so far in this world." "How can you make jokes at a time like this?" Jade demanded, angry that he just didn't seem to understand how dire the situation was. She had no magic. Phoenix cast her a quick, quizzical look as they ran. It helps me cope. Does worrying actually fix anything? Unable to think of an answer, Jade dropped behind, glaring at his back. The group ran north, always with half an eye on the silent wolf pack, padding alongside like ghostly bodyguards. As long as they ran in the right direction, the animals kept their distance. But as soon as they made any attempt to deviate, a flurry of snarling and growling would begin. The banks of the lake steepened, turning into a rocky cliff with crumbling edges. Still the wolves pushed them on, hounding them right to the edge of a deep gorge. Skidding to a halt, the 5 weary travelers peered into its freezing depths without enthusiasm. Rocks loosened by their weight tumbled down into a stream that fed the lake. The sides were sheer and slippery, the water a jumble of black pools, swift white water, and shadowed gray rocks still topped with snow and ice. "It's too deep and fast," Jade yelled above the noise of rushing water. "We can't cross here. Truda and Bryn will get swept away and we'll all freeze in seconds. There has to be..." "There." Bryn clutched at her arm, pointing upstream. Sure enough, his sharp eyes had spotted a possible crossing. A thick log. Fallen in some past storm, it lay askew from bank to bank. The closest end was anchored precariously in place by a tangle of roots still clinging to the eroded bank. Dead branches protruded from the trunk in awkward directions. Moss, lichen, snow, and ice covered every inch of bark. Hardly a 3-lane bridge, it would be a dangerous and difficult crossing. Jade saw Phoenix glance at the tree, down into the stream bed and over his shoulder at the wolves behind. He swallowed hard. "Oh man," he murmured. "I hate heights." She laughed nervously, perversely glad that he was showing some anxiety. Served him right for being so superior before. "You can always stay here and play with the nice doggies," Bryn teased. Phoenix sent him a sour look. "Just for that, you can go first." The boy shrugged. "Suits me. I'd rather be on that side any time." Eyeing the waiting wolves warily, he edged toward the dirt-clogged root ball. The wolves backed away, giving ground. The black wolf sat on his haunches, eyeing them all in a disdainful manner, as though he had better things to do and just wished they'd get out of his territory. Marcus watched the wolves as the others watched Bryn. The boy picked his way, clambering over exposed roots, onto the thickest part of the fallen trunk. There were no branches there, so he moved slowly, arms outstretched like a tightrope walker, feet shuffling inch by inch along the slippery bark. Shadows lengthened. Jade held her breath. Reaching the halfway point, Bryn wrapped his arms the first branch. He jumped a little, making the entire tree flex and creak. Jade couldn't help the little sound of fear that escaped her throat. Phoenix groaned. Truda clutched at Jade's arm, hiding her face. Bryn jumped again, grinning at them. "It'll be..." His foot slipped, and he lost his balance, yelling as he slid half off the rotting wood. He held on, fingers barely clinging to end of the thin branch. It bent under his weight. Phoenix took off, outdistancing the others as they hurried to help. Wolves forgotten, Jade and Truda watched helplessly as Phoenix scrambled onto the log. Bryn slid further, both feet now dangling high above the white water below, his cry for help lost in the roar. A mist of droplets clung to his hair and fur clothing, giving him a strangely ghostly appearance. Jade racked her brain for a spell, anything that might help. Her mind was blank. She had nothing. It seemed that every spell she knew had been wiped somehow, and she was just an ordinary person again. Her body shook with fear and the effort to remember. Nothing. Despair gripped her. Phoenix, visibly pale and sweating, wobbled his way along the fallen log, arms extended, eyes firmly fixed ahead. He reached down to grab Bryn's arm. Hauling the boy up, Phoenix waited until he'd steadied himself, Then the pair continued to the other side, both breathing hard. Even from a distance, Jade could see Phoenix's hands shaking. At least he had done something, though. If it had been left to her, Bryn would have fallen. Numb, Jade barely heard Marcus's low-voiced urging, barely remembered the perilous, slippery walk across the log bridge. She had failed. When her friends needed her most, she hadn't been able to do anything. She really was useless, just as her mother had always said. The minute Jade set foot on the opposite side of the river, the feeling of helplessness doubled until she felt physically ill. She saw Phoenix and the others eyeing her with concern, but couldn't make herself voice words of reassurance. Behind her, the others talked about the departure of the wolf pack. She ignored them, watching the forest instead. Truda yelled something in her own language at the black wolf, stamping her little foot in anger as it bared yellow teeth at her. Phoenix made some sort of comment about the pack's odd behavior, but Jade ignored that, too. Something was wrong. Something worse than wolves. She just didn't know what. She trailed along as the others turned away from the ravine to continue the hunt for a settlement before darkness fell. What else could she do? There was nothing definitive she could go on to warn them. An all-pervading fear of the unknown was hardly a threat they could stick their swords into. "We'd better find shelter soon," Marcus called out over his shoulder to Phoenix. Phoenix nodded and pointed at a fallen log near the lake edge. "We need a few minutes to rest, though. Those wolves pushed us hard." The two youngest companions, red-nosed and exhausted, lurched a few more meters to sit on a rotting log. Jade, however, filled with nervous energy, strode back and forth before them, casting anxious glances in all directions. Her breath clouded the air in great white huffs. She eyed the sun. It sank lower. Unless the village was within a few hundred meters, there was no way they were going to reach it tonight. If it even existed. Marcus was right. They needed shelter. For some reason, the thought of being out at night sent a paralyzing wave of fear through her, making her stomach lurch. Desperate, she hauled Phoenix and Marcus to one side, her fingers digging into their arms like clamps. "It's getting worse. That feeling, I mean," she stuttered urgently. Letting go, she wrung her hands around the smooth wood of her staff. "I can't think. It's like when you're about to walk into an exam you haven't studied enough for and your stomach is all churned up and sick. But much, much worse." She looked away from their blank, puzzled expressions, searching for something in the woods. Something she couldn't see, but knew was there. Phoenix and Marcus followed her glance. "I can't see anything, Jade." Phoenix laid a soothing hand on her arm. She shook it off impatiently. He was right. There was nothing to see. Maybe that was the problem. She narrowed her eyes in suspicion. The woods seemed very bare in this part of the world. There was no undergrowth and not even any reeds around the edge of the lake, just bare earth, patches of slushy snow and brown pine needles. That could be because they had arrived before the true beginning of spring, and the vegetation simply hadn't sprouted yet. Otherwise, nothing seemed amiss. "We got away from the wolves." Marcus spread out his hands to indicate a total absence of danger. "What else is there?" Jade sucked in a shaky sob and turned a wild look on Phoenix. Her hands trembled uncontrollably now, fingertips white. She ran a hand through her hair. I don't know. I don't." She darted a look around again, half expecting an attack any second. "I can't concentrate. There's something here. Somewhere. It's blocking my magic. It's horrible. Destructive. I can't stand it much longer." She wrapped her arms around her body and shivered. Phoenix frowned, hesitated, then shrugged. "All right. You sit down a moment. I'll keep watch." He turned to watch the empty forest as the others rested. Jade sank onto the log next to Truda. The girl leaned her head on Jade's shoulder and patted her leg with gentle concern. "It's okay." Truda's childish voice interrupted Jade's fearful thoughts. "You just need to eat. Here." She pushed something into Jade's fingers. "Try this." Distracted, Jade ate automatically, watching the surrounding forest for signs or enemies. There had to be some reason she was feeling so jittery. It was several seconds before her brain registered that what she was chewing wasn't dried or smoked meat. It tasted like bitter lettuce. Confused, Jade glanced down at the food Truda had given her. It was a flower, its many pink petals dewed with sparkling drops of water, large and cup-shaped. Its heart darkened to the deepest scarlet, dusted gold with pollen, a vivid splash of exotic color in this otherwise gray-green place. It rested like blood in her cold, white hand. A red water lily. With growing horror and bewilderment, she stared first at it, then at Truda's innocent, smiling young face. Did Truda know what the chemicals in this flower did? Was she deliberately trying to sabotage Jade's ability to function? Jade shook her head, trying to think straight. She blinked. The world began to blur. Slowly, a strange feeling of peace settled over her turbulent thoughts, muffling her fears until she couldn't remember why she'd been so worried in the first place. Everything seemed distant and unimportant. What a relief. What had she been doing? Oh yes, eating something. That's right. She was very hungry. Vaguely, she lifted another petal to her lips. Phoenix turned to glance over his shoulder at Jade. She seemed a little calmer, at least. As he watched, she placed something pink into her mouth and chewed slowly. Truda sat beside her, patting her hand and nodding like a wise old lady. Jade blinked, the frown clearing from her smooth brow, her expression turning blank and serene. He looked more closely. What on earth was she eating? 2 long strides brought him to her side. With an angry exclamation, Phoenix snatched the flower from her hand and tossed it to the ground. It lay there, a broken, bleeding heart on a patch of dirty white snow. "What is that?" he demanded angrily of Truda. The child shrank from him, her big blue eyes wide. "Just a water lily," she said fearfully. "They just make you happy when you chew them. Everyone knows that." Jade was all worried, and look. She pointed at Jade's beautiful, no-calm face. "See, she's fine." Catching Jade's face in his hands, Phoenix slapped her cheek gently. She turned glassy green eyes on him and smiled. "Oh," she smiled with childlike delight, her words slurring almost unrecognizably. "Red water lily, of course. Now I know where we are." She giggled, and her eyes drifted closed. "Jade." Phoenix shook her slim shoulders. Her head rocked a little, but her blissful expression remained unaltered. When he let her go, she simply sat there, smiling. He rounded on Truda, fear lending sharpness to his voice. "You drugged her. She said she knows where we are." Truda ducked behind Bryn, who half-turned as though not sure if he should protect her. "But Uncle Loki gives it to my brothers, Magni and Modi, all the time," the godchild wailed. "He says it settles them down." Jade was getting so upset. She bit her lip, burst into tears, and hid her face in her hands. "I'm sorry. I didn't know it was bad. It usually takes heaps to make Modi go quiet." Phoenix stepped forward, a hand reaching out to throttle her. He checked himself, threw up both hands, and made a noise of sheer exasperation. "Girls, why did they have to cry at you?" How did he explain to a 6-year-old that a worried, anxious, alert Jade was better than a peaceful, stupefied one who couldn't do anything now to save herself or them? Ah. Taking several long, slow breaths, he tried to calm himself. Okay, Truda was just a kid. She didn't know any better. So with Jade in La La Land, they would have to be extra cautious and really watch out for whatever she had been scared of. Knowing exactly where they were would have to wait until Jade was back to normal. Is there an antidote? How long will the effect last? He demanded, trying to speak calmly when he wanted to shout at Truda. The girl shrugged. I don't know, but it won't hurt her. When Phoenix scowled at her, she hastened to add more. Unkaloki gives Mag and Modi 2 or 3 flowers each, and it just makes them kinda dopey for a little while. She gave a sheepish little smile. He hates it when they make a racket and tease him. He says he just wants them to stop being pests. I know how he feels, he muttered, glaring at her. But he frowned at Jade's blank stare. She only had a small part of one, so why should she be so out of it? Perhaps, Marcus's deep, thoughtful voice intruded, she's more affected because she's a half-elf. You could be right, Phoenix agreed. Elves were closely bound and connected to all things natural. It made sense that Jade would be more affected by a natural sedative than the children of a god. Damn it, he exclaimed, slapping his hand on a tree trunk. Talk about bad timing. Okay. He drew a long breath and tried to think logically. Bryn. He laid a hand on the youngster's thin shoulder. You'll have to keep us heading northeast as planned. Think you can. Keep an eye out for any kind of shelter, though. In a flash, the young boy's troubled expression cleared. Giving Phoenix a mock salute, he skipped a few steps in the right direction. Of course. Follow me. Phoenix grinned at the youngster's infectious enthusiasm. Marcus, you go next with Jade. The Roman nodded and took Jade by the hand. She moved without resisting, like a sleepwalker. You, young lady. Phoenix shook his finger at Truda. Will stay with me where I can keep an eye on you. No more surprise like that, understand? He growled. She bit her lip and nodded, falling into step with him. By the way, he asked after a few moments, where did you get that lily? Oh, they grow in the lake. She waved a hand in that direction. He glanced out across the water. The lake was just as empty as before. There were no scarlet flowers anywhere, no plants of any sort, not even any birds. He eyed the girl suspiciously. There's nothing there. Where did you find it? She blinked up at him and shook her head. I didn't find it, she explained. I growed it, silly. Chapter 6, Phoenix stopped short, grabbing Truda by the shoulder and spinning her to face him. You grew that lily flower, he demanded. When? How? Ahead, Marcus and Bryn halted and turned back, pulling Jade docilely along with them. Truda scuffed a toe in the damp earth. Just now? It's just what I do. She shrugged a shoulder. You know. Phoenix crouched in front of her and gripped her arms. She looked back at him, her eyes huge. No, Truda, he replied with barely curbed impatience. I don't know. You'll have to explain it to us. How did you grow that flower? Bryn gasped. The power, remember? The Druids said something about us wanting the Jewel of Asgard for its power. The Druids draw their magic from nature, and they said they had used the star's power to fight the Romans. This must be what they meant. I mean, he stared at the girl in thoughtful fascination, as though assessing her usefulness in a new way. She is the daughter of a god, after all. She must have some sort of abilities. Is Bryn right? Phoenix demanded, straightening up. Are you some sort of deity? Truda blinked in confusion. Deity? Oh, you mean a god? She considered it. I guess, but I don't have any, like, worshippers or anything. What can you do? He tried to keep eagerness from creeping into his voice. Perhaps he had just been presented with a weapon of mass destruction, or a way to instantly transport them all vast distances in some magic chariot of the gods. There was a long pause as they all stared at the girl in hope. "I can make plants grow," she finally replied in a small voice. Phoenix's rising hopes fell with a resounding thud. He sighed and dropped his hands from her arms. "That's it. You're some sort of minor goddess of plant growth." "Hey," Truda was indignant. "I helped Gefjun to make Hodor go away, and then I helped the plants grow again." She put her hands on her hips. "This year, Gefjun said I was going to be helping the farmers' crops grow, all on my own. And if I don't get back to do it in time, Hodor will stay, and Ragnarok will come." She nodded sharply and raised her button nose in the air. Phoenix sighed again, wishing Jade were alert enough to tell him who was who in Norse mythology. She was the reader. He had no idea. Thor, he'd heard of, but these other two, and Gefjun and Hodor are... He prompted. "Gefjun is goddess of fertility and farming," Truda explained, rolling her eyes like he was stupid for not knowing. "Hodor is the god of winter, of course. Without me, Hodor keeps the snows too long, and the farmers can't plant their crops." She looked critically at the frost-hardened, bare ground. "If I don't get back by my birthday, the seasons will be all unbalanced. Hodor will stay, and there will be winter, then fire, then Ragnarok will come, and the gods will..." "Yes, yes," Phoenix interrupted sarcastically. "We know the drill. 4 more days or gods and giants will fight. Mankind and the world will be destroyed. Ra-de-ra-de-ra." He bowed. "Well, after you, my lady. Must get you home so you can send Hodor packing and get those plants sprouting. Can't have Ragnarok happening on our account, can we?" Bryn tugged on his arm, frowning. "Truda just said something about things being unbalanced. And do you remember when the Druids talked about having to send Truda away to keep the balance? What do you think it means?" Phoenix shrugged, too irritated to worry about philosophical ideas at that point. "I haven't got a clue. Personally, I think the Druids were just sick of her and wanted to get her out of their hair as fast as possible. And I have to agree with them. Come on. We need to get moving if we're going to get her home before the whole damned world explodes." Far from getting Truda home, they managed only a few more kilometers before the short northern day dwindled quickly into gray evening. The village they'd hoped to reach was nowhere in sight, and the forest bore no indications of human use. No wood chopping, no clear paths, not even much animal life. Phoenix peered through the darkening dusk and swore. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to rely on Jade's superior, half-elven vision at these times. The moon was coming up, and they couldn't travel much further without food, anyway. They had to find shelter before nightfall, but darkness was creeping in mighty fast. "There," Bryn called excitedly. "Up ahead there's a cave, I think." "Great." Phoenix was relieved, but as Bryn dashed off, a sobering thought occurred to him and he yelled out, "Be careful. Watch for, bears and stuff." The youngster gave him a wave of acknowledgement over his shoulder and began to approach the cave mouth from the side rather than front on. Marcus and Phoenix drew out their swords. Truda huddled against Jade, holding one lax hand. Jade swayed gently, still not alert enough, even to run if there was trouble. Phoenix saw Bryn strike a spark with his flint and coax a small amount of brushwood alight. He then lit some sort of rag and wrapped it around a thick branch. As Phoenix watched, the boy peered cautiously around a protruding rock and flicked the branch deep into the cave. After a few tense moments, Bryn glanced back over his shoulder and gave a thumbs-up sign. Phoenix nodded, and they all advanced. Inside the cave, The torch was still alight, its flickering golden flames sending shadows dancing across sloping stone walls. A small chamber off to one side of the larger front cave was safe and big enough to shelter them all easily. Best of all, it was dry and empty. Bryn inspected the floor and sniffed the air. He frowned and shook his head. I don't think anything lives here. Hesitating, he looked around again. It doesn't smell like an animal den anyway, but he sent a worried glance around. I know what you mean, Phoenix agreed, eyeing the rear of the cave where a large opening showed only vast darkness. The ground is packed down here like something often walks through, but it doesn't smell like an animal den. People? He asked, raising an eyebrow at Marcus. Surprisingly, it was Truda who answered. Oh no, she assured them. All the people live in houses, not in caves. The only time they use caves is for sacrifices to the Aesir. But there's no bones or anything, so it can't be that. Aesir. Bones. Marcus and Bryn spoke at once, asking exactly the questions Phoenix wanted to. He was getting kind of sick of Truda's little surprises. Oh, she giggled. I keep forgetting you're from Albion, not here. The Bretons have different gods. The Aesir are the gods, like me. She pointed a finger at her chest. But the people who live in Midgard, rolling her eyes, she stopped Bryn's question before it started. Midgard is this world. Asgard is where the Aesir live. Where I live, anyway. The people who live in Midgard sometimes make sacrifices to Grandpa Odin. Sacrifices? Bryn squeaked. Truda grinned at his fear. Silly, they don't sacrifice people. At least not much anymore, just goats and stuff. It's a bit gross, really. She made a face. It doesn't look like they do it here, anyway. That'll do, Phoenix interrupted, hoping to turn the discussion away from bloody animal sacrifices to pagan gods. It was almost full night, and they had yet to find food. This was no time to stand around discussing religious practices. Ushering his little band into the cave, he made another of Bryn's torches, then set him and Truda to gathering firewood. Marcus settled Jade on a stone ledge off to one side, well wrapped in her furs and cloak. Much to Phoenix's disgust, she promptly fell into a deep sleep from which no one could wake her. I guess she'll just have to sleep it off, he grumbled, standing over her inert form. Marcus cast her an anxious look. I'll try and find some game. He glanced out the cave entrance. I don't like my chances at this time of night, though. Strange, he frowned. I haven't seen many traces of small animals, or even big ones, since we crossed that river. Phoenix exchanged worried looks with him, and together, they both gazed back at Jade. Do you think it has anything to do with whatever she was afraid of? Phoenix gave voice to the question they were both considering. Possibly, Marcus admitted. But if something's taken all the local game, we're going to go hungry tonight. Well, Phoenix sighed. Go hunt. But if you're not back in an hour, I'm coming after you. The Roman gave a half smile and gripped Phoenix's forearm in a gesture of friendship and equality. Unslinging his bow, he turned and ran lightly out the entrance to be swallowed by the thin, cold darkness. Truda and Bryn returned with great armfuls of brushwood and branches. Most of it was damp, so the result was a smoky, smoldering fire that did little to heat the cave. Without complaint, Bryn bullied Truda into coming closer to dry her soaked boots and thaw her chilled hands. She pouted, coughed, and complained about being hungry. The grumbling of their stomachs could be heard across the room. Sighing, Phoenix pulled out the Hylian Bagia, thrust his hand in, and hopefully requested food. Nothing slapped into his hand, so he tucked the bag back into Jade's pack. He knew the endless bag had Roman javelins, money, and who knew what else in it. But obviously they'd eaten all the food. Oh well, it had been worth a shot. There were a meager few strips of baked bird meat left in his pack. He handed them around with the advice to chew slowly, as it might be all they got. Again, Bryn simply nodded, while Truda groused. Phoenix glimpsed Bryn pushing his own share into Truda's hand, but decided not to say anything. The boy had proven himself tough enough for this journey over and over again. He wasn't going to humiliate him by acting all fatherly and making him eat his food. When the hour was almost up, Phoenix moved to the entrance and stared out into the silent blackness. The first silvery rays of moonlight filtered through the canopy, but the shadows still outnumbered any faint patches of light. Something wasn't right. The feeling had been creeping irresistibly over him ever since they'd entered the cave. Something was very wrong, and it had nothing to do with the gnawing hunger in his gut. Bryn appeared at his side, looking outside at Truda pattered up to huddle behind both of them, her face peeking out over Bryn's shoulder. I don't like this. Marcus is taking too long, but if I go, you two will be unprotected, with Jade still comatose. Phoenix growled. I wish we'd reached that village. At least we'd know where we are. Then maybe we could work out where to go next. Oh dear, Truda said softly. I hope he hasn't run into a troll. Phoenix forced a laugh. Don't be silly. Of course he hasn't run into a troll. Truda's big eyes blinked solemnly up at him. There are no trolls around here, he said sharply, hoping she would agree. We don't even know where we are. How could you know if there are trolls here? There was a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach as she continued to stare at him. Please tell me there are no trolls here, he begged. But we're in Troll Tivan, she stated. Of course there are trolls. Of course there are trolls, he repeated facetiously, slapping his own forehead. Oh man, he paused, eyeing Truda. Hang on a sec. You said you didn't know if you'd recognize Troll Tivan. How can you be so sure now? She widened her eyes. Jade told me just before she fell asleep that we are in Sviland, so then I recognized it from when Pot took me hunting 2 summers ago. We're in the great Tividen forest. Troll Tivan's the bit in between Geatsland and Sviland. Nobody comes here. 'Cause of the trolls. The look in his eye sent her ducking behind Bryn. Phoenix clenched his fists together and shook them silently at the stone ceiling. Preserve me from all irritating, know-it-all, superior and yet amazingly stupid females, he yelled inside his head. It wasn't safe to make that sort of request out loud in a world where gods really did exist and might just grant it. Right at this very moment, though, he would be very, very tempted to say yes, please, if some handy god offered to take both Jade and Truda away. Jade was an over-anxious brainiac sometimes, but Truda was worse. She seemed to know instinctively exactly when to reveal bits of information so they would cause the most chaos. Telling them about Troll Tivan before they'd let the wolves herd them headlong into it would have been a whole lot more useful. He should have paid more attention to Jade's fears. Trying to get a grip on his frustration, Phoenix paced the short length of the cave a couple of times, while Bryn and Truda watched him in wide-eyed silence. Sucking in 5 long, slow breaths, he finally put a lid on his emotions and faced the pair calmly. Okay, Truda. He stood before her, arms folded. Talk to me. Tell me where we are and where we need to go to get you home. No. He put out a hand to cover her mouth as she opened it. Belay that. I have to get my priorities straight. Tell me about trolls. If Marcus is in trouble, I need to know how to defeat them. She shook her head. The only way I know of is daylight. They can't be killed by anything else. Her voice was muffled by his hand. Phoenix took it away and wiped it absently on his shirt. "Nothing," he demanded. She shook her head again. "What about iron weapons?" He drew his sword. "If they're magical creatures, then they should be susceptible to iron like Jade is." He half-turned to look at Jade's peaceful features and remembered how Agricola's iron blade had scalded her cheek in Britain. The druid's spring right had smoothed the mark away. Damn, if only she were awake. She could fight the troll with magic. Or maybe not. Maybe this troll was what had been blocking her before. "Oh no," Truda said with horrible cheerfulness. "Trolls aren't like elves. They aren't affected by iron or magic. In fact, trolls have such thick skin that weapons just bounce off and magic just doesn't even work around them." "Nope." She shook her head blithely. "Only sunlight kills them. Turns them to statues straight away. Fabulous. It's only, 10 hours or so until morning." He scrubbed both hands through his hair, trying to physically pull an idea out of his head. Jade. He needed Jade awake. She always seemed to come up with the brilliant schemes at the last minute. All he knew how to do was fight, and apparently that wasn't an option this time. Striding to Jade's side, he shouted at her to wake up, then reached out and shook her roughly. Her whole body flopped, and her head, too. Bryn rushed over to push him aside. "You'll break her neck," the boy yelled. "Stop it!" Phoenix turned away and snatched up a water skin. He poured liquid over her face. Surely that would work. Freezing water dribbled down her white cheeks and made little puddles in her ears and at the base of her throat. She slept on. "Damn it, Jade," he whispered. "What do I do?" Outside, a hoarse, masculine scream sounded in the distance. It was followed by a sound like large rocks being forcibly ground against each other, and then another yell tinged with despair and fear. With one last, hopeless glance at Jade, Phoenix gripped his sword and strode toward the cave entrance. "What are you going to do?" Bryn peered up at him, his own little knife held tightly in one hand. Phoenix stared out into the darkness. "I have no idea, but I have to help Marcus." He laid a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Whatever it is, we'll try and kill it or lead it away. If we're not back by morning, take Jade to find that village and... I don't know." His mind was numb. "Do whatever she says." "But weapons won't work if it's really a troll," Bryn reminded him. "I know that, but Marcus doesn't. I have to help him. Look after the girls. I'm counting on you." The boy swallowed and nodded. Swiftly, he made another torch from a rag and a thick branch. Handing it over, he whispered, "Good luck." Phoenix grinned through gritted teeth. "I think I'll need it. You too." Brandishing the torch before him, he stepped out into the inky night. Chapter 7. Phoenix walked into the crisp, cold darkness and shivered. The torch in his hand cast an uncertain orange light on the ground. Overhead, just visible through the sighing treetops, the waning moon shone in a star-dusted sky. Its pale light served only to make the shadows blacker and the trees bigger. Again, the ominous sound of huge rocks grinding together echoed through the silent forest. And again, Marcus yelled his defiance. Phoenix turned toward the noise and began to run, carefully. The torch sputtered and sizzled as he peered ahead, trying to pick the safest path. Once he stumbled and almost dropped the torch into a shadowy snowbank. Soon his breath came in sharp spurts as he pushed himself harder and took more chances. He had to get to Marcus before he was slaughtered. The grinding noise grew louder, and Phoenix skidded to a halt as he came up to a large boulder. Holding his torch behind him, he edged forward and peeked around the corner. There, just visible in the center of a large clearing, stood Marcus. His sword drawn, 3 dead hares at his feet, the Roman stared upward with a mixture of fear, defiance, and resignation on his face. Phoenix followed his gaze and almost dropped his sword in shock. Towering over his friend was what appeared to be an enormous stack of gray, lichenous rocks, teetering in a strange, gravity-defying formation. The grinding sound he'd heard came from the very top. The piles moved, and Phoenix swallowed a gasp of terror. With movement, the heap of rocks resolved into a horrendously huge living thing. It was over 20 feet tall, with a body that appeared to be made of granite, and limbs that were more of the same. Lumpy, chunky, hard, stone. He supposed the misshapen pile of boulders on top could only be its head. It had to be a troll. From high above, a long arm descended, thick fingers bunched into a fist. Marcus skipped aside, and the fist smashed into the ground with the sound of a small earthquake, splattering the hairs. As he turned, Phoenix saw Marcus clutched at only the hilt of his now shattered blade. His bow was slung over his shoulder, the quiver empty of arrows. Again the arm smashed down. Again Marcus danced away. Again that crunching, grinding noise sounded, this time almost rhythmically. With a start, Phoenix realized it was the troll, laughing. The beast wasn't trying to kill Marcus. It was playing with him. Marcus had to be tired. He had had little sleep after fighting the Romans in Stonehenge, and the wolves had pushed them hard through the forest today. Phoenix could hear his breath coming in ragged gasps as he spun away once more. It was only a matter of time before Marcus lost his footing on the wet earth and was crushed to death beneath that juggernaut fist. Desperately, Phoenix looked around for inspiration. Where was Jade with her ideas when he needed her? Nothing leapt to mind. There were no convenient solutions lying around. His heart raced and his brain seemed to be swimming in stupidity. Thumping the heel of his hand against his own forehead, Phoenix cursed himself. Think. If he were sitting safely in his chair at home, and this were on the computer screen, how would he handle it? Impossible leaps and ninja karate kicks wouldn't help against a giant made of rock. What would? Not weapons or magic. What was left? Daylight. Phoenix glanced up the silvery moon, hours away. What was a substitute for daylight then? A fragment of smoldering cloth fell from his torch, biting into the back of his hand. He absently pressed the small burn to his cold cheek, then pulled it away to stare at the scorch mark. He looked at the burning torch. Well, it wasn't daylight, but if the trolls were truly creatures of the night, perhaps they hated flame almost as much. It was worth a try. He glanced around. What could he burn, though? Everything was soggy with the recent snow. Everything except... Phoenix looked up at the nearest pine tree and grinned wickedly. Pine forests. Lots of flammable oils in pine needles. His mother was forever telling him to be careful at Christmas time, in case their tree went up in flames from a carelessly held candle. So now it was time to see if her worry was justified. Reaching up, Phoenix touched the torch to the lowest branch of a tree and held his breath. The needles sputtered and sparked, flared, and went out. Thin gray spirals of scented smoke soared into the air. No, it had to work. Resolutely, he pushed aside the horrible thought that their Christmas tree might actually have been plastic. Everyone knew that pine trees burned easily. He risked a quick look at Marcus. The boy half knelt on the wet ground, shoulders heaving. He staggered back to his feet, just in time to dodge another thunderous blow from the chortling troll. Phoenix thrust the torch right into the midst of a dense patch of needles. This time, they caught, flickered, dimmed, and then burst into bright little flames that ate their way quickly up to the base of each needle. He held his breath, watching, hoping. Just as he thought the fires would stutter and die, a gust of wind fanned the little flickers into bigger ones that jumped up up to the next branch and the next. With a massive whoomph that seemed to suck the oxygen from his lungs, the whole tree overhead blazed and came alive with dancing golden light and heat. Startled, Phoenix shielded his face and backed away, afraid the whole thing might start dropping fire on him. There was a horrific, deafening avalanche of sound. He spun to find he'd backed into the clearing, and Marcus was running full tilt toward him. The troll roared again and took 2 large steps toward them, but the burning tree was right behind, warming their backs. The troll put his hands up to protect his craggy face, and stayed where he was. He turned his ponderous head to and fro, in an effort to see past the glare and find his quarry. Panting, Marcus grabbed Phoenix's arm. "Thanks," he gasped. "It's not over yet," Phoenix warned. "The only thing that kills them is sunlight, and there's still quite a few hours of night left, I'm afraid." "What?" Marcus puffed, frowning. "Are we supposed to do then?" "I think..." Phoenix turned to look up at the tree. Its burn time had been short. Even now, the last of the oil-rich needles was sizzling into extinction. There wasn't enough wind to make the fire jump to the next tree. "I think," he repeated, "we're going to have to run for it. Can't you just..." Marcus waved an arm at the tree, set a few more alight and drive it away. "Sure," he replied, "but that might set the whole forest on fire, or even send it straight back toward Jade and the others. Can't Jade do anything? She's still asleep. We couldn't wake her up. Believe me, I tried. Besides, Truda tells me magic doesn't work on trolls either. Must have been what was causing her so much trouble before." "Is that what that thing is?" Phoenix nodded. "Evidently we're right in the middle of troll country." "Oh, this keeps getting better and better," Marcus muttered. Phoenix quirked a quick grin. "Ain't it great? Can't have things getting too dull." Marcus sent him a sardonic look. "Dull would be a nice change. I'd even opt for boring." The troll chose that moment to roar at them in its unintelligible, gravelly voice. Phoenix gripped the torch tighter and pointed with it in a direction away from the cave. "I don't like your chances of dull or boring happening anytime soon," he said. "Let's take turns distracting it and hope it's too stupid to realize what we're doing." So began the longest night in Phoenix's life, either of his lives, in fact. For hours the two ran, staggered and fell through the cold forest. They took turns hiding and resting, while the other carried a torch and ran in a different direction, making enough noise to attract the troll's short attention. Whenever it looked like losing interest, they would yell or light another tree to get it stirred up again, always careful now to choose isolated trees. It had occurred to Phoenix only after setting the first one afire that a full-scale forest fire might not be such a great idea. Always the troll thumped after them remorselessly, untiringly, sometimes roaring, sometimes laughing as though this were a hilarious game these puny humans had invented just for its enjoyment. Late in the night, the moon set, and the boys could no longer tell what direction to run. They were exhausted, cold, and soaked from the knees down. Phoenix couldn't feel his feet or fingers any longer. He wondered if they were frost-bitten. The ground was treacherously slippery underfoot. They stumbled and fell more and more often. At last, even their torch sputtered and gave up, leaving them in utter darkness. Starlight gleamed off to their right. Water. A lake. Considering how many lakes and streams they had seen, it was a miracle they hadn't fallen into one. "I can't keep going," Marcus whispered. He rested in the deep shadow of a tree just to Phoenix's left. Phoenix stood with his back pressed to another tree, head down, hands on bent knees taking weight off his legs, breathing hard. "Me neither," he admitted. Not far away, A loud, crunching, crashing sound told them the troll was close on their trail. Although made of rock, the beast seemed to have the nose of a bloodhound and the night vision of an elf. It delighted in sniffing out their hiding places. "We could try the lake," Marcus suggested. "I don't think you can drown a rock," Phoenix disagreed. "Besides, we'd freeze to death in that water." "Got a better idea?" The Roman sounded aggravated. Actually, he tried to sound confident, hoping he was right. "I do. We need to make for high ground. Dawn's not far away now." That at least was true. In the last few minutes, black shadows had begun lightening to dark gray. A hint of pale sunrise colors showed in the east. If they were really lucky, they might be able to keep the troll occupied for another half an hour. Then, if they were really lucky, it would be too far from its cave home to run back when the sun rose. Unfortunately, Phoenix had become so turned around during the night that he had no idea in which direction his friends were. He did, however, have a very bad feeling that the cave that currently housed an unconscious Jade and 2 children was the home of their friendly little troll. The tree holding Phoenix up shook violently. With another grinding chuckle, the troll grabbed and pulled it right back like a giant slingshot. Fear gave both boys a spurt of adrenaline, and they sprinted away just as the rock hands released the trunk. It twanged and creaked in an arc toward them, the tip of the pine dipping low before snapping upright again and swaying to and fro. Phoenix scrambled uphill as best he could, picking his way between huge boulders and hoping desperately that none of them would turn out to be trolls as well. He could hear Marcus's uneven breathing close behind. Too close for comfort came the sound of enormous rocky feet stomping on the slope below. "Have you," Phoenix panted, "got your flint and tinder?" "Yes." Phoenix paused to glance up and then back over his shoulder. The beast was gaining on them, but so was the light from the eastern sky. It would be close. Resolutely, he gritted his teeth and pushed on his aching thighs to force himself up the slope. "When we get to the top," he called breathlessly, "I'll distract it while you find something to set fire to. I don't care if it's your own clothes. I want it trapped in a circle of fire when dawn comes. Got it?" "Right." Marcus wasted little breath on the acknowledgement. Abruptly, the slope leveled out, and they emerged from beneath the canopy onto a strangely level hilltop. It looked like a small mountain had been sheared off cleanly by an enormous sword. Phoenix searched rapidly for a hiding place. Unfortunately, the area was not only perfectly flat, but also perfectly clean. Not a tree, rock, or even a bush broke the unforgiving openness of the space before them. Not even a convenient patch of long grass or ferns. There was nowhere to hide. Phoenix had no breath to spare on swearing. He staggered to the very center of the clearing and cast a desperate glance over his shoulder at the eastern horizon. It glowed beautifully pink and gray, in a way that early rising joggers would have admired. For Phoenix and Marcus, however, it had a worrying lack of bright, shimmering sunshine. Sunrise was at least 20 minutes away, and there remained absolutely nowhere they could hide from the troll for that long. Phoenix stood a few moments longer in the middle of the space and exchanged despairing glances with Marcus. His legs were jelly, and each breath stabbed at his lungs. Sometime during the night, he'd fallen badly on his side. He suspected one of his ribs was fractured and was sure his right ankle was seriously twisted. As long as he didn't actually look at the bruising, he could convince himself the pain was irrelevant. "Go," he managed to gasp at Marcus. "I'll try and keep it busy." The Roman nodded and stumbled off to the other side of the clearing. Phoenix prayed silently he would find enough dry tinder and willing trees in time. The top of this hill was bigger than he'd hoped. Marcus would have a difficult job to get the entire thing encircled by flame in time for sunrise. If he didn't, this could be the first and last sunrise that Phoenix would ever almost see, even as the morbid thought of his own death by flattening occurred to him. Phoenix felt a spurt of relief through the exhaustion and fear that blanketed his mind. He had already died once. His knife still had 6 jewels on it. Hypothetically, he could die 5 more times and still come back to life. One death had been more than enough, and he wasn't even slightly keen to test this hypothesis. Besides, there was always the chance that the troll would simply squash him repeatedly with that enormous fist until all of his remaining lives were gone. What would happen then? Would he be truly dead? Or would he find himself back in the real world? Was that an option? Could they just die enough times to get free of this game? No, they had a task to complete as well, he remembered. Stopping Feng Judai was more than just winning this game. It would save both worlds from a horrible future. From just beyond the edge of the plateau, thunderous footsteps and that crunching laugh sounded ominously close. Phoenix saw the troll's ugly head and massive fingers appear as the beast idly brushed aside a 50-foot tree like it was made of spider web.